The doorbell rings exactly at 7:30. My students form a clumsy line at the classroom door while I finish arranging the desks. 25 smiling third graders walk in, some more hyped than others for another day of class. My name is Olivia. I'm 27, and teaching is the only thing I've ever wanted to do. "Good morning, Teacher Olivia," they all shout as I raise my hand to kick off our morning routine. This has been my life for 5 years now. A modest apartment in Brooklyn, the same daily routine, the same coffee at the corner cafe before heading to school. The basics are enough when you love what you do. My mom, Rebecca, always says I got that from her, the knack for finding joy in simple things. It was at that very corner cafe that fate stepped in one October morning. It was raining so hard that the line for orders spilled out onto the sidewalk. While waiting, I noticed a tall guy trying to balance an umbrella, a briefcase, and his coffee all at once. "Need a hand?" I asked when he nearly spilled everything. He smiled gratefully. Actually, I could use 3. His name was Jack, 30 years old, and he worked at an investment firm. Nothing about him screamed extraordinary, just genuine kindness, and eyes that really listened to what I had to say. We ended up swapping numbers after about 20 minutes of conversation, like we'd already known each other for years. We met up for dinner that same week, then for a walk in the park. Soon our weekends became inseparable. Jack was unlike anyone I'd ever met, intensely present, genuinely interested in my work with the kids, without that impatient masculine vibe I'd experienced before. "Hey, we're planning a field trip to the aquarium next week," I mentioned. One night, as we prepared dinner together. "The kids are studying marine ecosystems." "Interesting," he replied, sounding strangely distant. "I'm not sure I've ever been to this aquarium." 3 days later, Jack asked if he could join the class as an extra volunteer. I thought his interest was adorable, even though I noticed he seemed a bit nervous. Field trip day arrived, where our kids were over the moon about the sea creatures, especially at the underwater tunnel where fish swam right over our heads. Jack stayed quiet the whole morning, constantly checking his watch. When we got to the main tank, where that huge humpback whale was on display, I noticed that my students were acting oddly. Hidden smiles, secret looks. "Teacher Olivia," called Emma, my shyest student, "I think there's something in the tank for you." I walked up to the glass. A professional diver appeared, holding up a waterproof sign. "Olivia, would you make me the happiest man in the world?" When I turned around, there was Jack, down on one knee holding a small blue velvet box. My students had formed a perfect semicircle around him, each holding a letter that spelled out, "Marry me." "You've changed my life," said Jack, his voice trembling slightly, "and I want to spend the rest of it making you as happy as you make me every day." Amid tears and applause from the kids, I said yes. It wasn't until after the proposal that Jack finally came clean. He wasn't just some regular guy. He was an Anderson, heir to one of the biggest corporate fortunes in the country. His modest apartment was really just a place to be closer to work. The family home was on a property in Long Island that could easily house a small village. "Why hide all this?" I asked, more curious than hurt. "I wanted you to know the real me, not my surname or bank balance." I understood his hesitation. What I didn't expect, however, was the invite to dinner at the Anderson mansion the following weekend. The property was intimidating. Perfect. Gardens. Security everywhere. A house that looked more like a museum. Jack took my hand as we walked in. Thomas Anderson was nothing like his son. Where Jack radiated warmth, his father exuded calculated coldness. His wife, Eleanor, looked like a porcelain statue by his side, giving a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Dinner passed in an awkward silence, until Thomas finally spoke. "So, an elementary school teacher? Interesting. Career." His tone made it clear that interesting meant unsuitable. "Jack mentioned you grew up with just your mom," he continued. "And your father?" "I never met him," I replied flatly. "He died before I was born." Thomas nodded as if confirming something to himself. "Well, as a business lawyer, I insist on certain formalities before the wedding." An assistant suddenly appeared with a briefcase full of documents. "A prenuptial agreement is standard for families like ours," he explained, sliding the papers in my direction. Jack looked embarrassed. "Dad, can we talk about this later?" "There's no time like the present," Thomas shot back. "If you really love her for who she is, it shouldn't be a problem." I picked up the documents and skimmed through them. The agreement was absurdly one-sided. I'd basically have no rights if we ever split up. regardless of how long we were married or the circumstances. Everyone's eyes were on me. The tension was thick. I grabbed the pen from the table and signed every page without a second thought. I'm here for Jack, Mr. Anderson. Not for your money. I never needed it before, and I'm not about to start now. Thomas's expression wavered between surprise and something that almost looked like respect. The following months were a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Jack wanted something intimate, and I agreed, but the Anderson family insisted on a grand celebration. Family tradition, they argued. I gave in on some points, but I stood firm on others. The church was going to be the very same one where my mom had been married, and my students would participate in the ceremony. A week before the big day, my mom showed up at my apartment with a strange look on her face. "There's something I need to give you," she said, fidgeting nervously with her purse. She pulled out a yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax. It looked old, but well preserved. "What is it?" I asked, holding out my hand. My mom stepped back slightly. "It's from your father." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. "My father is dead." "Not exactly." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Robert gave this to me many years ago, with strict instructions to hand it over only when you were about to get married." "Mom, what are you saying? You always told me my father died before I was born." Her eyes filled with tears. "That was our agreement. It was for your protection." She handed over the envelope with trembling hands. "I can't explain everything. He asked that you read this on your wedding day, before the ceremony. Promise me you'll do that." I stared at the envelope, my name written on it in neat, elegant handwriting I'd never seen before. "Does this change anything?" I finally asked. "It changes everything," she replied. "But not today. Just keep it until your wedding day." I tucked the envelope at the bottom of my bedside drawer, trying to ignore the 1,000 questions exploding in my mind. How does someone keep such a secret for 27 years? And why reveal it now? In the days that followed, I did my best to act normally, yet the envelope seemed to throb from inside the drawer, calling out to me. Jack noticed my distraction, but chalked it up to wedding day nerves. I decided to honor her request and wait, even though it was incredibly hard. Wedding. Day dawned perfect. Blue skies, mild temperatures, like the universe was on our side. My bridesmaids were running around in the hotel room, fixing my dress, adjusting my hair, all chattering at once about how wonderful everything was. "Can I have a minute alone?" I finally asked. When everyone left, I locked the door, took a deep breath, and pulled out the envelope. My hands trembled as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and several official documents. I began to read. "My dear Olivia, if you're reading this, it means you've found someone to share your life with. I hope he's a man worthy of your love. My name is Robert Harris. I'm your biological father, and contrary to what you were told, I'm alive. The story of my death was necessary to protect you and your mother. 27 years ago, I built a company that quickly grew and attracted the attention of ruthless competitors. One of them, Thomas Anderson, tried to destroy everything I created through industrial sabotage, fraudulent lawsuits, and finally direct threats to our family. When your mom got pregnant, I realized I needed to disappear to keep you both safe. I faked my death in a boating accident, but I continued working from the shadows, building an empire that no one knew existed. The attached documents prove that you are the sole heir of Harris Industries, now valued in the billions. More importantly, through anonymous subsidiaries, I acquired 51% of the shares in Anderson Corporation. In other words, you now control both companies. I will be present at your wedding today. After all these years hidden away, I can finally reveal the truth. With eternal love, your father, Robert. I read the letter 3 times in disbelief. I examined the documents, share certificates, bank records, my name on every line. A knock on the door snapped me out of my stupor. "Olivia?" It was my mom. "It's time." I opened the door, completely dazed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "All this time. He kept us safe," she replied simply. "And now the moment for justice has come. What should I do? Get married. Everything else will fall into place." I stored the documents in the bag my bridesmaid was carrying. The walk to the church felt like a hazy dream. When I arrived, I noticed several unfamiliar luxury cars and men in suits who didn't look like ordinary guests. I stepped into the church foyer to wait. That's when I saw him. A distinguished man with gray hair and eyes just like mine. He smiled, a smile I instantly recognized. "Dad?" I whispered. "Olivia." His voice, saying my name with a tone I'd never heard before, yet strangely familiar. Robert Harris stepped toward me tentatively, as if he feared I might vanish. "You look stunning. You were alive all this time." It wasn't so much a question as a reality I was still trying to process. "For your protection," he replied, reaching out to take my hands. "Every day without you was torture, but it was necessary." The music started inside the church, a signal for the last guest to come in. My heart raced. "I don't know what to do," I confessed, feeling the weight of the documents in my bridesmaid's bag. "Marry the man you love," Robert said gently, with a smile. "If he's truly worthy of you, everything will be all right. If not," his eyes hardened for a moment, "well, I'm here now to protect you." My mom approached, silent tears streaming down her face. Rebecca and Robert exchanged a look heavy with decades of shared secrets. "Let's go in," my mom said, taking my arm. "It's time." "No," I interrupted, surprising both of them. "I want my dad to take me to the altar." Robert's smile lit up his whole face. "I've waited 27 years for this moment." Together, we walked through the church doors. The reaction was immediate. Whispers spread throughout the nave. Thomas Anderson, seated in the first row, went pale as if he'd seen a ghost, which in a way, he had. Jack turned to meet me at the altar, and his confused expression upon seeing Robert standing beside me shifted to pure shock. "But who?" he murmured. "My father," I replied softly as we walked down the aisle. Thomas Anderson abruptly stood up. "Impossible! Robert Harris is dead." The whole church fell silent. The priest, completely unprepared for such a deviation from the usual wedding script, just stood there open-mouthed. Robert smiled calmly at Thomas. "As you can see, the rumors about my death were greatly exaggerated." We reached the altar. Jack looked utterly lost. "Olivia, what's happening?" he whispered. "I'll explain everything," I said. "But first, let me officially introduce my father, Robert Harris." Robert extended his hand toward Jack. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Jack." Thomas advanced toward the altar, ignoring the priest's protests. "Is this some kind of setup? Harris died in a boating accident almost 30 years ago." Robert turned to face Thomas. The entire church watched, transfixed. "You thought so, didn't you, Thomas? After all the industrial sabotage, leaked secrets, and hiring thugs to threaten me?" Thomas stepped back. "You have no proof of any of that. In fact, I have all the evidence. Recordings, documents, witnesses. I've kept everything over these decades, just waiting for the right moment." The priest, realizing he'd completely lost control of the situation, tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion after the ceremony?" "No," I said firmly. "The guests deserve to know the truth before witnessing this wedding." I turned to Jack, who looked utterly stunned. "Did you know any of this?" "No," he replied honestly. "I swear, Olivia. My dad always told me that Robert Harris was some competitor who went bankrupt and then died in an accident." Robert stepped forward. "While your father thought I was dead, I was quietly building another empire. And through shell companies and anonymous investors, I acquired 51% of Anderson Corporation." Thomas staggered as if hit. "Impossible! I control the majority of the shares." "Not anymore," Robert said, handing a folder to one of the suited men now approaching the altar. "My wedding gift to my daughter is the equity control of your company, Thomas." All eyes turned to Thomas Anderson, who now looked about to collapse. Eleanor Anderson, pale and trembling, rushed to her husband's side. "Did your father send men to try and kill him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The priest, completely overwhelmed by everything that had happened, timidly asked, "Should we continue with the ceremony?" I looked at Jack, who looked just as lost as I had a few minutes ago. "It depends," I said. "Do you still want to marry me now that you know who I really am?" Jack took my hands in his. "Olivia, I fell in love with the dedicated teacher I met at a cafe, not because of your family name or bank account. The question is, do you still want to marry the son of a man who tried to kill your father?" The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. Jack didn't know a thing about his own father's actions. He had been real about everything he'd shown me. "Yes," I finally replied. We don't choose our family, Jack. We choose who we want to be. Robert stepped forward again, still holding my arm. If that's what you want, daughter, I'll walk you down the aisle with pride. Thomas Anderson, seemingly regaining his composure, was about to speak when several police officers entered the church. Thomas Anderson, one of them announced, we'd like you to come with us to answer questions regarding attempted murder and corporate fraud. Eleanor let out a stifled cry. The guests began murmuring in shock. The students witnessing the ceremony stared wide-eyed, as if watching the most dramatic episode of a TV show. Can this wait? Thomas asked, his old arrogance surfacing. We're in the middle of a wedding. Actually, the officer replied, we have a warrant based on recently submitted evidence. He shot a meaningful look toward Robert. I always knew this day would come, Robert said calmly, but it didn't have to be today. The choice is yours, Thomas. Either let the police take you now, or you can stay for your son's wedding, voluntarily come in tomorrow, and maybe even get some leniency for your cooperation. Thomas looked from Robert to the officers, then to Jack, and finally to me. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never expected. Shame. I'll stay for my son's wedding, he finally said, and I'll turn myself in tomorrow. The officers stepped back to the rear of the church, keeping a discreet watch. Well, said the priest, dabbing his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief, can we finally start? The ceremony continued, surprisingly beautiful despite the earlier drama. Robert led me to the altar where Jack waited, with our students scattering flower petals along the way. Jack and I exchanged vows under the watchful eyes of everyone present, including Thomas Anderson, whose expression shifted repeatedly from defeat to acceptance. When the priest declared us husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. Jack kissed me like we were the only two people in the world. The reception that followed was surreal. Two families who until just hours ago had been strangers now had to celebrate together. Robert Harris, the man who had re-emerged from the dead, was no greeted by curious guests. Thomas Anderson sat quietly in a corner, occasionally casting glances at Robert. At one point, I found my mom deep in conversation with Robert in a quiet corner. How did it go? I asked, approaching them. We were just reminiscing, my mom replied with a wistful smile. Your father apologized for all those years of absence. And was he forgiven? I asked, looking at Robert. Your mom was always the stronger one of us, he said. She understood that my absence was the only way to keep you safe. Jack joined us, carrying 2 flutes of champagne. Mr. Harris, I hope we can have a proper conversation once all this settles down. Count on it, Robert replied, shaking Jack's hand firmly. And you can call me Robert. After all, we're family now. Later that evening, before we left for our honeymoon, Jack pulled me aside into a quiet corner. Are you okay? He asked. Today was intense. I thought for a moment. I'm better than I ever imagined. I found my dad, learned the truth about my inheritance, and married the man I love. I just wish your dad had to face the consequences of his actions. Jack nodded seriously. He does need to face justice, Olivia. What he did was unforgivable. Justice doesn't always have to be vengeful, I replied. Maybe there's a path to redemption, even for him. The weeks following the wedding brought drastic changes to our lives. The media had a field day with the story of the resurrection of Robert Harris and the subsequent downfall of Thomas Anderson. Sensational headlines dominated newspapers for days. Empire built in the shadows. CEO accused of attempted murder. Teacher discovers she's a billionaire on her wedding day. I tried to keep my normal routine at school, but it was impossible to ignore the curious looks from parents and even other teachers. Luckily, the kids still treated me as always. For them, I was still just Miss Olivia, now Mrs. Anderson. Jack was facing his own challenges. With Thomas sidelined by criminal charges, the board of Anderson Corporation needed fresh leadership. As the natural heir, Jack was appointed interim CEO, a role he felt completely unprepared for. I've always worked behind the scenes, he confessed one night while going over piles of documents in our new home. I never wanted to be the face of the company. You have all the knowledge you need, I replied, sitting next to him. And something your dad never had, integrity. Meanwhile, Robert Harris was busy reorganizing his own companies. For years, he'd operated through subsidiaries and holdings, keeping his name completely out of the limelight. Now, he could finally take control openly. A week after our honeymoon, Robert invited us to a formal dinner. We were welcomed into an impressive office in downtown Manhattan with a view of Central Park, the headquarters of Harris Industries. "Welcome to the family's corporate home," said Robert, leading us to a conference room where a small group of executives waited. "Olivia, Jack, these are the top directors who helped me build this secret empire all these years. People I trust completely." After the introductions, Robert got straight to the point. "I spent decades building something meaningful, always intending to one day pass it on to my daughter. That day has come." He slid a folder in my direction. "This officializes the transfer of 75% of Harris Industries shares to your name, Olivia. The remaining 25% will be split among charitable foundations." I was speechless. Knowing about an inheritance theoretically was one thing. Actually receiving control of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate was completely another. "But I'm a teacher, not a businesswoman," I protested at last. Robert smiled. "And you can continue being a teacher if you want. But you're also my daughter, and you inherited more from me than just my eyes. I trust you to learn and lead." I turned to Jack, who looked as surprised as I did. "There's more," Robert continued. "With the equity control we hold over Anderson Corporation, I propose a merger between the two companies." The room fell silent. "A merger?" Jack asked, finally finding his voice. "These companies have completely different corporate cultures." "Exactly," Robert replied. "Anderson has always been known for its aggressive business tactics, often at the expense of ethics. Harris built its reputation on sustainable innovation and responsible business practices. Together, under new leadership, they can set a new corporate paradigm. In the following months, the merger came to fruition, creating Harris Anderson Global. Jack officially assumed the role of CEO, while I, much to everyone's, and even my own, surprise, became the chairperson of the board. We established new corporate principles focusing on sustainability, business ethics, and social responsibility. Many of the old-school executives from the Thomas Anderson era chose to leave, unable to adapt to the new philosophy. They were replaced by professionals who shared our vision. One of my first initiatives was to start an educational program across all company branches. Employees received incentives to volunteer as mentors in public schools. The Bright Future program quickly became a benchmark in corporate social responsibility. "It's amazing to see how you transform these companies in such a short time," Jack commented one evening while we reviewed the quarterly reports. "From teacher to corporate leader in less than a year." "I still consider myself a teacher," I replied. "I just now teach different values to a different audience." The truth was, I'd found an unexpected balance. I still spent one day a week at school teaching my beloved students. On the other days, I quickly learned the ins and outs of the business world, applying educational principles to corporate leadership. "Do you know what's even more incredible?" Jack asked. "Seeing my dad lose everything he built through dishonest means, while your dad, who operated in the shadows for decades to protect you, emerges triumphant." "I wouldn't call it a triumph," I replied thoughtfully. "Maybe poetic justice, if anything." Thomas Anderson's trial became one of the most talked-about events of the year in corporate circles. Even with all the evidence against him, including documents meticulously kept by Robert for decades, the sentence was relatively light. 5 years with the possibility of parole after 2, plus substantial fines. "Is that fair?" I asked Robert after the verdict. "Justice and legality don't always go hand in hand," he replied wisely. "But the real punishment for Thomas isn't prison. It's losing his company, his reputation, and most importantly, the trust of his son." Eleanor Anderson, who initially kept her distance from all of us after Thomas's conviction, surprisingly approached us a few months later. "Jack is all I have now," she said during a tense lunch, "and you're his wife. We need to find a way to get along." Over time, Eleanor proved to be very different from the submissive woman she once appeared to be. She was smart and observant, just silenced by years of living in Thomas's shadow. "I always knew there was something shady going on in Thomas's business," she eventually confessed. "But I convinced myself it was just the ruthless world of corporate dealings. I never imagined attempted murder." After 18 months, Thomas Anderson was granted parole for good behavior. His release from prison was low-key, without the media frenzy his trial had received. A month after his release, we received an unexpected request. Thomas wanted to meet with us, me, Jack, And, Robert, absolutely not, Robert replied immediately. He's my dad, Jack argued, despite everything. And he tried to kill mine, I countered, still feeling the anger of all that Robert had nearly lost. We debated for days. In the end, I agreed to meet him, but on our terms. It would be in a neutral location, at a private restaurant, with discreet security. Thomas Anderson looked as if he had aged decades in just 2 years. His hair was completely white, his face etched with deep lines, and his once arrogant gaze now low and cautious. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he began, his voice hoarse. No one responded. The silence hung heavy over the table. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "What I did is unforgivable. I'm here to offer redemption, perhaps." Redemption? Robert was the first to speak directly to Thomas. "In prison, I had plenty of time to reflect," Thomas explained, "about the man I became, the choices I made, the damage I caused. I lost everything I valued: power, status, respect. But the worst was losing my son's trust." Jack remained impassive, watching his father carefully. "So, what exactly do you want, Thomas?" I asked directly. "I want to help out," he replied. "Not to get back what I lost, but to make amends for some of the damage. I have knowledge, experience, and despite everything, I still have connections." "Are you asking for a job?" Robert asked incredulously. "I'm offering help," Thomas corrected. "Specifically with the Harris Anderson Foundation. I heard about the work you're doing in education and community development. I can help expand that using my contacts to raise funds and support." The proposal was so unexpected, it left us momentarily speechless. "Why the foundation?" I finally asked. "Why not something more lucrative?" "Because it's meaningful," he replied simply, "and because it would let me work with my son and his wife without interfering with the main business." Jack looked at me, the decision clearly in my hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once saw me as insignificant was now asking for my blessing to rebuild his life. "Let's set up a trial period," I finally decided. 3 months as a volunteer with the foundation. No title, no salary, no authority. Then we'll reevaluate. Thomas nodded, accepting the terms without argument, something unthinkable in the past. Over the next few months, we witnessed a genuine transformation. Thomas worked tirelessly for the foundation, using his knowledge and connections to significantly expand our programs. He showed a humility and dedication that even surprised Robert. Gradually, an unlikely reconciliation began to form. It would never be a friendship. There were wounds too deep, but a respectful coexistence emerged. Thomas found a true purpose in the foundation's work, especially in the educational programs. "Nunca imaginei que diria isso," Robert commented one day as we watched Thomas guiding volunteers. "But he really has changed. People can change when they lose everything," I replied. "The question is whether the change is genuine or just a strategy." "Time will tell," Robert concluded, "but I'm willing to watch and see." 5 years have passed since that fateful wedding day. Our lives have transformed in ways I never could have imagined. Harris Anderson Global became one of the most respected corporations in the world, not just for its financial success, but mainly for its values and ethical business practices. Just as I promised myself, I never completely gave up teaching. Every Friday, no matter how busy the corporate schedule, I'm in a classroom, no longer as a regular teacher, but teaching a special social entrepreneurship program that I developed personally. "Teacher Olivia, is it true that you're one of the richest women in the world?" a 10-year-old once asked, his curiosity as disarming as kids can be. "The papers say so," I replied with a smile. "But true wealth isn't about money. It's about what you do with it, about the lives you touch positively." The Harris Anderson Foundation, now mostly run by Thomas, became a powerhouse in the field of education. We created scholarships for teachers, mentorship programs, and model schools in underprivileged communities. Thomas dedicated himself fully to this work, finally finding a purpose beyond accumulating power and wealth. Jack and I built a family. Our son, Robert Thomas Anderson Harris, now 3 years old, grew up surrounded by love and solid values. We decided that he would learn early on about both the privileges and responsibilities that came with his name. My mom, Rebecca, who had carried our family's secrets for so many years on her own, finally allowed herself to enjoy life. She and Robert never rekindled a romantic relationship. but they developed a deep friendship based on the love they shared for me, and now for her grandson. One quiet afternoon, as our whole family gathered to celebrate our son's birthday, I found Robert gazing out at the horizon from our porch. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" I asked, joining him. "About how unpredictable life is," he replied, smiling. "I spent 27 years in the shadows, building an empire to protect you without knowing if we'd ever really be a family. Now just look at us." Following his gaze, I saw Jack playing with our son in the yard. My mom was chatting animatedly with Eleanor, who cradled our newborn baby, Sophia. And even more surprisingly, Thomas was taking part in the activities, helping organize a little badminton tournament for the invited kids. "If someone had told me this scene existed 6 years ago, I'd never have believed it," I commented. "Did you know Thomas came to see me privately?" Robert revealed. "He formally asked for my forgiveness. He said he didn't expect it, but he needed to ask." "And did you forgive him?" "Forgiving isn't forgetting, Olivia. It's choosing not to let the past control the future. So yes, in my own way, I forgave him." That night, after all the guests had left and the kids were asleep, Jack and I sat in the office going over some company documents. "You know what I realized?" he said, closing a report. "We're building something that goes way beyond just us. It's not just a business or a fortune. It's a legacy of values. A legacy I hope our children will continue," I replied. "But in their own way, following their own paths. Just like you did," Jack noted. "The dedicated teacher who became a corporate leader without ever losing her essence." I smiled, recalling that rainy morning in the cafe when a regular guy, or so I thought, nearly spilled his coffee. How a simple decision, offering a hand to a stranger, can completely change the course of a life. "You know what I love most about our story?" I asked. "What?" "That in the end, it wasn't about revenge or power. It was about justice and redemption, even for Thomas." "Poetic justice," agreed Jack, using the phrase that had almost become our family's motto. The next morning, like every Friday, I got up early and prepared my lesson materials. On my drive to school, I reflected on the incredible path that brought me here. I was Olivia Harris Anderson, teacher, businesswoman, wife, mother, daughter, each role equally important, each facet completing who I am as a person. When I walked into the classroom and saw those young faces looking at me with expectation, I felt the same excitement as on my very first day as a teacher. Because despite all the changes, some things remain constant, like the power to inspire and be inspired, to learn while you teach, and to find meaning in sharing knowledge. "Good morning, class," I began, just as I always did. "Today we'll talk about how small choices can lead to big changes. And nothing could be more true. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this."